Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the allegations regarding Sherrone Moore and his coaching staff regarding the Connor Stallions play calling scandal. Now, as you know, there were some allegations last year back in August of 2023 regarding Jim Harbaugh, Connor Stallions, and all those guys who, long story short, they had some assistants who were going to some other Big Ten matchups and pretty much, stealing signs and whatnot. Obviously, Jim Harbaugh got the 3-game suspension. Michigan went to go on and get a national title, and then Harbaugh left to coach San, the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, a year later, there's some new allegations that Sherrone Moore has, essentially, allegedly covered up some text messages regarding the allegations. Now, what's a little bit different between this time versus last time is that these are only level 2 violations, where the first time around it was level 1. Now, there are some reports speculating around that head coach Moore deleted approximately 52 texts, which was an exchange between him and staffer Connor Stallions. And there's also an allegation that Connor Stallions was able to make his way to a Central Michigan versus Michigan State game while he was dressed as in disguise while as on the Central Michigan sideline. Now, first things first, when, I read these allegations, first thing I ask myself is, how come Central Michigan hasn't had to answer to anything? Now, obviously they're not as big of a program as the Michigans or the Michigan States, etc. But if they're in any way, complicit in this sort of scheme, I would imagine that they should be facing some sort of penalty or sanctions too. Now, one of the big, obviously overlying issues is, you know, I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that the first time around, Michigan got a slap on the wrist with the 3-game suspension regarding this regarding the scheme. Now, obviously, Harbaugh's not going to say anything because he's in the NFL now, and he pretty much skipped town because he won the national title and all that stuff. But I think what I think what really this entire thing's really going to come down to is, how much of a role does the NCAA really have in, sort of being the gatekeeper of, college football? How much, authority do they have to make these sort of decisions? And, when I sit down and think about it, although they are repeat violators, there are multiple, I think 7 members of staff who, were a part of the scheme, including former defensive coordinator Jesse Minner, including Denard Robinson, who is now not a member of the staff anymore. And, there are definitely some overlying issues, first and foremost, obviously, you know, whether it's Michigan or Tennessee or, whoever recently had sanctions against them. I think the more and more we see this being litigated outside of, you know, the surface of the NCAA, the more we're going to see that the NCAA's presence and authorities is going to be limited and limited. And once we go forward with this, it's just going to prove that we're just going to see more and more changes when it comes to college football as a whole. Now, obviously, to me, what ultimately is going to happen is, they might get a 2 or 3 games. I'm guessing maybe no more than 2 or 3 game suspension, because yes, did Sherrone Moore allegedly, you know, sort of, try to sweep under the rug? Yes, but also he wasn't really the guy in charge when all this was happening too. Yes, he was the offensive coordinator, but also, it's pretty obvious too that Jim Harbaugh had a pretty, big say in what was kind of going on with the recruiting and, with the play calling and all that good stuff too. So, overall, when, you sit down and think about this, obviously everyone's going to blow this out of proportion and make this a bigger deal than it is. And I am, for one, not necessarily defending Michigan. I'm just simply pointing out that, although, do I think that there needs to be something done about this, because right now the NCAA has just been nothing more than a wild, wild west. Absolutely. But at the same time, you have to kind of think to yourself too, you know, at what point do these allegations of these different things that happen, eventually cause the transition between the NCAA kind of facilitating everything versus perhaps, there being independent bodies who are sort of overseeing football, such as what the NFL has with the commissioner of Roger Goodell, or you look at NHL with Gary Bettman, some sort of equivalent of that, where everyone's kind of policing themselves, but there is sort of a standard rule set where certain teams are you know forced to be abide by these certain rules too. And when I do look at what could possibly happen to them, just purely from Michigan standpoint, obviously they have a lot of questions this year with the amount of turnover they have. I think it is a big W that that Sherrone Moore is able to get done. Martingale, who was the New York Giants coordinator last year, to oversee the defense, so that should definitely help. Oversee that transition where he can kind of focus more on what he does best, which is the offensive side of the ball. Yes, he's going to have to replace JJ McCarthy. Yes, Blake Corum isn't there anymore, but they still have an outstanding offensive line. The recruiting class is still there, and the defense is still as consistent as ever. And I think that they're anywhere near Ohio State in terms of talent level? No, but are they so far behind to the point where you can pretty much write them off in the Big Ten? Not necessarily. I mean, they're still going to make a bowl game. They're still going to have 8, 9, 10 wins this season, somewhere in that threshold. And when I look, I'm particularly focused more on the first half of the schedule, considering that if this does go further and they do decide to spend Sherrone Moore for a handful of games, let's just say if they do the same sort of 3 games that they did for John Harbaugh, you know, the stretch really isn't that bad outside of they they do start off with 5 home games. So start off with Fresno State, which pretty much a glorified tune-up game now that they don't have Jeff Tedford anymore. You do host Texas, which obviously is a big matchup. So I obviously it's not a good look that your head coaches would be suspended for that big of a game. But also, if you look back at last year, they did decide to bring back Jim Harbaugh as soon as the Penn State game happened. So I mean, there are definitely some variables there, but ultimately, I mean, to me, what this could end up being is really just a message saying that the NCAA's power is just significantly limited to what it was before, and that this will really kind of just oversee an overhaul in terms of the NCAA that is desperately needed.